Thank you. Welcome again, if this is your first session or your second session of the day, to the Brass Spring 2026 Online Symposium. I'm Nora McKenzie. I'm the chair of the Business Reference and Academic Libraries Committee and also the co-chair of the Symposium Subcommittee alongside Kelly LaVoice. We also have a fabulous subcommittee that has helped make everything go smoothly today and in the many months before today to get everything up and running. And that includes Christy Cunningham, Kate Cummings, Brian Garrison Wynn, and Doris Dewey. All of our sessions today are recorded and they will be sent out to those who are registered along with the slides from the presenters. So if you haven't already, please go ahead and mute your audio and your video as we get started. Thanks again for spending time with Brass today and all of our presenters. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Christy Cunningham, who will be moderating our next session.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. Our next presenter is Christina Gangwisch from Georgia State University. She will be talking to us about teaching graduate students when and how to use AI in research and reviews. So, Christina, if you want to share your screen, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Christy. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We should be ready to go. If I can just get a few thumbs up
Looks
to make sure
good.
that everybody can see me and the screen. Okay, well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm so excited to talk with everyone about the work that I've been doing. So, my name, as Christy said, is Christina Gangwisch. I'm the business librarian for Georgia State University. And as I said, I'm really excited to be able to talk to you today about my experiences teaching graduate students about artificial intelligence tools for research and reviews. I do want to add a quick note that I do have a lot of links in the presentation that will be shared in the chat and via my references list as well, so that you can look at them during the presentation or later if you would prefer. And I've also budgeted some time at the end of the presentation for questions and discussion. But if you do have an urgent question, please feel free to put your question in the chat so that I can make sure that we follow up with you. Okay, so thank you very much. Let's get started. So the first thing I'd like to ask is how many of you are teaching graduate students about AI tools for research and reviews right now? And I'm going to give you guys just about a few quick seconds to a minute to respond. If you are not familiar with Slido, you can go ahead and either scan the QR code or use the URL and put in the Slido code and passcode. Okay, great. Just give it a few more seconds. So I can see a bunch of you are, and that's really exciting. All right. So right now it's a question of we're about half and half. Okay. So thank you all for your answers. It's really helpful to know a little bit more about your experiences as, like I said, we start this discussion, because I do think it's a new area for a lot of us and we're all learning together. So just to give you a quick overview of the presentation, before I start, we're going to cover a lot of material, including institutional policies and resources at Georgia State University. I know those are going to be specific to us, but depending on your particular situation, I hope if you don't already have guidance from your administration, that some of the resources that I'm going to share might be helpful to you so that, you can bring these conversations back to as I said, your administration and, engage with them about what you need to help support your work in this area. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the benefits and limitations of AI tools for research and reviews, standards and guidelines. We'll talk about some popular third-party AI tools, and then have a discussion about library databases integrating artificial intelligence, and, wrap up with teaching students about, the human and environmental impact of AI. And then, as I said, we'll have a Q&A session. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Georgia State University, I did want to share some quick facts about us. Specifically, we have 7 locations in the Metro Atlanta, Georgia area with 6 campus libraries. We're one of 4 R1 research institutions in the state of Georgia, and we have approximately 53,000 students enrolled in over 300 programs ranging from associate through doctoral degrees. I am the university library's liaison for the Robinson College of Business, which has 2 campus locations, one in Atlanta and one in Buckhead. And RCB has 12 academic departments and 8 research institutes. Our total enrollment is around 8,000 students with a breakdown of about 6,800 undergraduate students and approximately 1,200 graduate students. And since we're talking about artificial intelligence today, I did want to share just a little bit of the context from RCB. So we have launched several AI degree programs and certificates and have also incorporated AI into over 50 of our courses. Most of the faculty that I have talked to also consider it very important to their students to learn about AI to prepare them for their future careers in business. And they're very open to including information about AI and how the students can use it during library instruction sessions. And in fact, they're asking for it. So today, though, the group that I really want to focus on is our DBA students. Our DBA students are really a wonderful group of talented and knowledgeable professionals who are working across a wide range of disciplines. Many of our students live elsewhere in the United States or abroad, and they only travel to campus for a few days each month and only during the spring and fall semesters. So it's a very concentrated program. When I started my position at Georgia State University, the director for the program and the academic director reached out specifically to me to ask for workshops on literature reviews and citation managers, but they were also really eager about having, conversations and workshops for students about artificial intelligence. And over the past couple of years, we've built a really strong relationship. So I've been able to enjoy the opportunity to work with their students every semester and to really kind of build relationships with their students. Um, so during this time, though, I've really noticed as I've worked with these students that there are a couple of challenges that we need to address to really make sure that they're getting the support that they need. So my experience has been that many of them are not familiar with our research databases. They're really sort of mostly, familiar with just searching Google Scholar for research. And, there's a little bit of a learning curve for them. For some of them, it also might be their first time, that they're really conducting a literature review. So they really can need some help and some guidance on focusing their research questions and then, specifically on figuring out how to conduct those comprehensive searches in our databases. Most of them are also, as we've discussed, very curious about artificial intelligence tools and, how they can use this new and emerging technology to really help them specifically with their literature reviews. But they're also not really sure which tools are out there, um, and which ones they should be using and what the benefits and limitations of those tools are. And one of my challenges really too is also to make sure that they know how much information our databases cover that isn't necessarily accessible through third-party tools. So there's a lot of complex issues that we have to cover. So typically when I start my AI tools for research and review workshops, I really kind of start by beginning to talk about our institutional policies and where they can find them. As I said, we're really very fortunate at GSU to have a very clear university AI policy and also to have an academic honesty policy that specifically addresses how students should be using artificial intelligence. And I think it's important to make sure too that the students also know where they can find information about university license tools. So, like others have mentioned, we have a commercial subscription to Copilot and some other tools. And often I find when I talk to students and faculty that they don't know that this is available to them or how to access those, those tools with their credentials. Um, and, there's also been conversations about tools that we have prohibited for students to use and making sure that they're aware that there are certain tools that they're being not, asked not to use, as well as what they can do with the different types of data that they may be collecting or using for their dissertations. Okay. Since most of our AI tools also have the option to upload documents, and when I say most of our AI tools, I mean, third-party tools specifically that I've been teaching about. I've also started to have conversations with students more about database terms of use. And from those conversations, I know that some of our students are completely unaware that there are any restrictions at all on what they can do with the licensed content that they have access to through us. And they may not have thought about the implications of uploading content into, a tool that we don't subscribe to, that gives us no commercial protection. So I really think it's important to make sure that students are aware that, the entire university could lose access to our databases if we are violating those terms that we have, set with the vendors. And, along those lines, I have a little bit more knowledge about that because I've been working with our department head for our collection development and discovery department. And, we've had conversations around the specific language in our database terms. And, the fact that, like I said, our vendors are adding tighter and tighter restrictions on, how they're expecting us to, protect their data and make sure that students aren't, uploading it into artificial intelligence tools. So the main point that I really try to make when I talk to students about the benefits of using an AI tool or artificial intelligence, and specifically natural language tools, is that these tools really aren't a replacement for human effort. So I try to let them know that they can be useful for certain aspects related to literature reviews and can be beneficial if they're used appropriately, but only when they're used appropriately. I do want to make a pitch here for the Evidence Synthesis Institute. If you, like me, are supporting some faculty and students that are conducting systematic reviews and haven't already had any formal training in evidence synthesis, I would really recommend that you consider, participating in the Evidence Synthesis Institute because I was fortunate to attend in March 2025. It was a great opportunity. Moving on, when we talk about limitations of AI tools, I make sure that my students know that, there are some, limitations on what artificial intelligence tools can do for specifically certain types of reviews. So if they are, doing a more systematic review, again, they might be more limited on what they can use a tool for. Um, and I also try to make sure that there are some other concerns as well that they need to be aware of. And then we go through each of these topics individually. So we talk about, what the current literature review standards and guidelines are, again, for those who are following, more stringent regulations or rules around what they can do for their type of review. We talk about ethical issues in AI, and then we talk about concerns around large language models. And we also talk about intellectual property concerns, publisher guidelines, and then about documentation and citations. So, while most of my students are, as I said, conducting narrative or scoping reviews, as I mentioned, I do have some that are attempting to conduct either a systematized or a systematic review. And I really like to point out to those students that, they have the option as they're trying to make sure that they're following those more rigorous standards to review the responsible use of AI in evidence synthesis papers, which are published on the Open Science Framework site, so that they have a better understanding of, what they need to be aware of. But I do generally kind of summarize it for them and explain that the gist is that, AI tools can generally be considered safe to use for things like brainstorming keywords, helping to construct Boolean searches. They can be useful for translation or help with finding sources. And they can also be helpful in assisting with screening and data extraction. Okay. I do think it's really important, though, especially when you're working with, your graduate students, to spend a little bit more time talking with them, as I do with my doctoral students, about the ethical issues surrounding artificial intelligence and, reviewing the key points so that you're all on the same page about the kinds of issues that they need to be aware of, like, for example, with bias and how the training data can really bias the results. Um, you know, most students I find are generally pretty up to speed about privacy and security concerns. And they've heard some cases that have made them aware that they need to be checking their sources when they're using AI. So generally they're very comfortable, or at least somewhat aware of accountability and responsibility. And I think, again, talking with them about transparency and reproducibility issues in the context of reviews can be really important as well. Um, I do like to follow up the conversation about key ethical issues in AI about or with a reminder that they do have access to commercial data protection through our university subscription to Copilot, and specifically what that means for how their data is retained and shared so that it can, give them options if they are very concerned about privacy and security. The next thing I like to talk about is really, going into depth about concerns regarding LLMs. So I talk a little bit about these, and how LLMs are the foundation for all text-based generative AI tools. And then I explain, with research ethics, that really refers to the fact that LLMs can't evaluate if keywords are being used in the wrong context, which can really kind of result in false and misleading information. That research integrity really refers to concerns about transparency around how the information was selected, as well as whether the tool fabricated references and or provided inaccurate information. Then we talk about research quality, referring to issues with researchers, particularly those with less experience, being misled by inconsistent or inaccurate information, as well as the fact that these tools can often miss a lot of academic research that's behind paywalls, as well as gray literature, so your company, industry, and government reports. And then we talk about, trustworthiness of sources. So acknowledging that, there's some problems with the output from generative AI tools, specifically around lacking in-text citations. So in some cases, that can result in unintentional acts of plagiarism. The fact that, again, AI tools can hallucinate or make up references and can mislabel non-scholarly sources as peer-reviewed scholarly sources, causing other issues as well. One thing that I think we need to be doing too with graduate students is also reminding them, hey, you need to be checking your sources, and going over exactly how they can do that for them to give them a roadmap. So my particular preferred method for checking source credibility is my Caulfield SIF method. So that's what I teach my students. But I was very excited recently to learn that Caulfield is working on an edit for SIF that he's calling SIF for AI. And in the future, I plan to incorporate his guidance into my workshops because I think, it really is a thoughtful update that can guide my students in how they should be evaluating that content generated by whatever tools they're using. I mentioned before a little bit about the fact that I talk to students about intellectual property concerns. Much as with entrepreneurial students, we have students who hope to go on and publish their work later. And I think, we need to be making sure that we're instructing them on the risks for them related to their intellectual property, and how it could be potentially stolen if they're uploading their content into an unsecured AI tool. So I really make a point to have a conversation and discussion with my students about, you know, those concerns. And sometimes I like to pull up some articles, or cases about copyright claims against artificial intelligence companies to help kind of start off that conversation. I did want to share that the Copyright Alliance does have a tool for tracking AI court cases involving copyright claims. But, as I said, I like to pull up titles using like Factiva. You could use another news source, and browse the headlines and really see what kind of interesting articles you can find to show your students during your next workshop. I find that's my favorite part of the workshop sometimes. Aside from the intellectual property concerns, I do want to make sure too, as I mentioned, some of my students are hoping to go on and publish their work. And I think it's important to make sure that they're aware that publishers now have a lot of guidelines, including parameters around the acceptable use of AI or AI assisted tools. For example, most publishers won't let you use an AI generated image, that you in your submission, because there's too many questions around ownership. So I tell my students, if you're going to be using your AI tools for anything, it's really best that you check any potential publisher websites and view their requirements, and guidelines so that you can avoid a potential issue later and save yourself a lot of headaches. I also let them know that publishers are going to run their article submissions through plagiarism checkers, and that, if they happen to be someone who speaks English as a second language, their submissions unfortunately might be more likely to be flagged based on their word choice and grammar. So that's something that, we can try to talk about ways to avoid any potential concerns, or, check for how to kind of have a problem because of their, just how they speak and write. I do think it's helpful too to talk to students, early on about documenting how they're using AI tools and make sure that they're aware, you have to start this right away. Not only because you want to make sure you're complying with the university's academic honesty policy, but also, and those publisher guidelines. And then, specifically so you have notes that you can use later when you're trying to write up your method section for, how you found your research for your dissertation. And I explained to them, like I said, the kinds of things that they need to include. So specifically, what AI tools did you use, including the version and date? Why did you select those tools? How did you use them for your research? And what kind of prompts did you use? And how did those, prompts evolve? Or, how were they developed over time? And I always reassure them, if you have questions, contact me, ask me, and that's something we can figure out together. So I want to pause here again and ask everybody if you've been teaching about third-party tools, if you would care to share some notes about what you have been doing. And I see Benjamin has shared some other sources. Thank you, Benjamin. All right. See some great responses. So a lot of people teaching about Site AI, ChatGPT. I will say one of the things I was aware of, when I was thinking about this presentation is how different it could be for each of us depending on what our university subscribes to. Okay, I'm going to give it just a few more seconds so people can wrap up, and then I'll share with you a little bit about what I've been teaching about. Okay. All right. I'm going to move on to the next slide, but keep typing if you want to. Okay, because we can always follow up later. All right. So, like I said, it's been an evolution with these workshops for me from the time I started to the where I'm now. There's a lot that's been changing. So when I first started teaching about AI tools to my DBA students, I really, kind of was exploring a lot of third-party tools. And I always liked to share during those workshops this great graphic that Zoanna Mayhook created for our workshop at Sociable last year that we did with Jing Liu from Purdue University, where Zoanna also is, and then Jennifer Horn at Kentucky University. And I all collaborated on this, workshop for the pre-conference. But Zoanna had created this really helpful graphic that I think really conveys really the breadth of, what some of our AI tools can do. So brainstorming and topic overview, literature discovery, snowballing and mapping, synthesis and knowledge management, and then, things like editing and citing sources, although those kind of have more AI integrations than actual generative AI functions. Um, but, just getting people to understand kind of like what the different tools are, what tasks they could perform. And then, also in my early workshops, I spent a lot of time kind of really explaining to students about grounded and ungrounded tools and how those work differently, how one tends to hallucinate less. And then I would sometimes give like a brief overview about how to write good prompts using the different building blocks to ensure that the AI tool that they were using really kind of gave them the desired output that they wanted. Um, so when I was teaching these workshops too, I tended to focus on the three tools that I've mentioned here: Perplexity, Elicit, and Research Rabbit. But I did tell students, very upfront that I could only provide limited instruction on them because I personally don't subscribe to them and because we don't have any institutional subscriptions. Um, and I do see a question too, Lily, about subscribing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we have access to as well. So just going back though to Perplexity. When I would start with Perplexity, I would explain to students that it's really an AI search engine with cheap chatbot features. And one thing that it could do is would link to the source content, because it's a grounded tool. I would let them know that really what it was helpful for is kind of topic overviews, brainstorming search terms and concepts, and then to kind of help them refine their research questions. And we would talk about the different features and go through some things, demonstrate, how you could build upon, your initial prompt and kind of refine things more with Perplexity.
Christina, it's
Mhm.
2:25.
Oh, thank you. So, the next thing that we would talk about was elicit, and I would explain specifically that it was designed to help researchers with their literature reviews. It too is a grounded tool, and it builds on or draws from the semantic scholar corpus. It does cover all academic disciplines, but it really only has limited access to full text, excludes some non-academic literature and some content specifically behind paywalls. I would tell my students that it could be really useful for finding scholarly articles, and to help them review article summaries and, maybe to do some of their preliminary analysis. Okay. And then finally, I'd show my students Research Rabbit, and I'd help them to see how it could, allow them to visualize connections between papers and authors using the citation mapping features. I really liked Research Rabbit too because it's also a grounded tool, and it includes papers that are indexed both in PubMed and Semantic Scholar. I did think it was a helpful tool for students who really wanted to see how their works were connected and who wanted to use the timeline graphs to see the chronology of topics. I was a little sad recently, this past fall, they moved away from allowing it to be free for everyone, to a option for a paid model. But I do want to point out if you have an academic, account, academic email, you can still get access to Research Rabbit for free. Um, but you'll notice kind of in my conversation, a lot of what I was telling my students early on is these are really supplementary. And as I've kind of evolved this workshop with my students, I've really sort of decided to pivot from teaching about third-party tools, and it's been for a couple of reasons. One of the main reasons that I started rethinking my approach was that I really started to grow more concerned that I was encouraging students to bypass the resources that we have and to miss out on a lot of really high quality subscription content. Like many of you, often I've got a one shot with students until I see them the next semester or the next workshop. We don't have a lot of time to discuss, the specific things that they're doing unless they schedule a research appointment with me. And I really wanted to make sure that, they were getting the best of what we had to offer. I also noticed too that as I was, using these tools myself to prepare for workshops, they were really constantly changing, limiting access to desirable features, and they were really, really pushing on the students to subscribe to use them. So, charging more and more money, sometimes, for things that they already had access to through our databases. So, additionally along those lines, I also noticed how many of our library databases are really integrating AI. And I decided it was really a better use of everyone's time and effort to learn about the new features within the databases. So, many of these features I noticed they're kind of similar to what's been offered previously by some of these third-party tools. And, yet they also have the benefits of giving students more control over and opportunities to evaluate their search strategies and adjust things as needed to find really what they needed when they were searching. So for example, at Georgia State University, we have access to Business Source Complete. And, I noticed that once they added their natural language search feature, which was built, by the way, using Anthropic's Claude Haiku v3 model and the Bedrock AWS platform, that feature can parse conversational queries and it can convert them into Boolean keyword queries. So really that brainstorming kind of feature that, they might have used previously for Perplexity is something that they can take advantage of within the database now. And they can tailor it specifically to what they need to do for their research question. So I've been showing students how they can use the natural language search to put that research question in and then get suggestions about how to refine it, or look at the refined query and see specifically what search terms and how these were put together with Boolean operators. Because again, a lot of my students are not really maybe as familiar with using our databases, so this is really helpful to them. I've also emphasized to students that this really gives them a level of transparency and reproducibility that hasn't previously been offered by some of these third-party tools. And, I also tell them, hey, as opposed to other sources, you can actually check the Database Publications Authority to see what it's covering and make sure that the specific journals that are key for your subject area are included in what it's checking. Um, and, I've explained too to them, there's an added level of privacy and security because our vendor doesn't collect user or query data for training purposes. So you have that added, protection. And really most importantly, I've also highlighted to them that our databases offer this text access to the proprietary license content from our vendors that, previously they weren't able to access through a third-party tool. So they're really getting a much more complete picture of the literature landscape, and that can include the gray literature as well. So ProQuest, our vendor for our library database, ABI Inform collection, and many of our other databases, also has the research assistant tool that uses artificial intelligence. So I've really been teaching about that as well. That particular tool was built using the chat or the GPT-40 mini open AI LLM. And there are several features that I found that I really like about the research assistant. For example, I find that it can help the students brainstorm keywords based off their original search query and database content and the database content. And that can really kind of help them to refine and focus their searches. I like that it has summaries of the key takeaways as well as the findings and conclusions. I, of course, tell students, you need to read the article itself, not just the summaries. Um, and then, it will generate definitions of the important concepts from the document context. It'll explain the relevance and allow them to run searches for those individual terms within the database again to find other content. I do also appreciate that it can point students to additional research topics and then allow them to explore themes with that visualize topics feature that it also includes. So, my takeaway from this is that I, explain to students, it's really important too that they also check more than one database. So one technique that I've been doing during my workshops too is to really kind of guide the students kind of through some techniques that they can use. So like we build a search using the natural language search and business source complete, and then we bring it over into ABI Inform collection so that they can see, what other information they can find, what are their sources, and then also find additional ways that they can use the research assistant features to add additional keywords to help them narrow down their focus based within, again, the content in that database. And, I also explained that that research assistant feature, can really offer them those useful features to help them analyze, synthesize, and interpret the data from the articles. But even better than that, and you'll see in the screenshot here, it points them specifically back to the supporting quotes from the articles within the document text. So again, there's a level of, transparency there about, where this AI content is getting whatever information it's providing in those summaries for them. And I think that's really beneficial. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, how are you integrating the artificial tool, or are you integrating the artificial intelligence tools in your databases into your teaching? Okay, yes. So glad to hear that. Okay. Again, I do want to say it has been a journey. And I think, like I said, we're all doing different things and learning how we can use this technology. All right. Gonna give it just a few more seconds. I want to leave some room for a few more points and then some discussion if we have time. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. Okay. So my takeaways for the advantages of using the library databases, I really feel, as I said, that, it's important for us to promote the high quality subscription content that we have access to with full text. I like that our databases are stable and they rarely make major changes to their interface. As I mentioned, a lot of the tools I had been teaching about, I could check it one day and it would look one way, and then I would check it another day and something could have completely changed. A feature could be turned off. I think, there's a lot of value around the transparency about, what publications they index within there. And, that gives the students much more knowledge about, what information they're drawing from. I appreciate that they have searchable subjects authorities or thesauri, and that they consistently reproduce the same search results. And of course, who doesn't love a citation tool, right? I mean, that's great there. We know that that's a big benefit to students who might need to, keep track of what they've looked at, aren't using a citation manager. But I think there's, like I said, a lot of advantages for us to really promote library databases over a third-party tool. And I hope that
135, Christina.
you'll be, using them as well. Um, but what I wanted to kind of conclude with is just a conversation about whether or not we should be talking to business students and faculty about the human and environmental impact of artificial intelligence, particularly as more and more of our databases are including these features. All right. Okay. I think we have a consensus. So I don't think I need to convince you happily. I think everybody's kind of as concerned about this as I am. But I personally think that there's two things that we can really do in order to kind of engage with our students and faculty about how they can lessen the negative impacts of artificial intelligence on us and on our environment. And that's, by having conversations with them about, like if you don't know, these are the impacts, increased greenhouse gas emissions, water consumption, water scarcity, all the things that we know are happening to our world. And, encouraging them, if you're going to be using AI, make sure you're using the right tool for the right task and in the right way. So let's not be wasting the value of, what we can accomplish with these tools by using it in inappropriate ways or in, ways that aren't as efficient as possible. But I think there's another way that we could be to helping, and that's to talk to our vendors. Put pressure on them not only to integrate new technology to compete with third-party tools, but also to be really transparent about the human and environmental impact of artificial intelligence features as they are adding them into their databases, so that we're more knowledgeable, as we choose to use a particular database, what the impact is. So I really want to thank you all for your attention today. If you want to see any of the references that I've discussed during this presentation, I do have a QR code that you can access the references list by scanning. And as mentioned, my slides will be shared. And this is the point where if you guys have questions, or if you want to share about your own work, let's talk.
Christina, thank you so much. There were a
Yeah,
lot of conversation going on in the chat. I
that's
did pick a
good.
few questions, so I'm going to go back
Okay.
and ask, and maybe I should have stopped you. One person asked if you were defining a scoping review as a type of evidence synthesis or as a type of literature review. And the person said, my library considers it the former, and I would be hesitant to use AI for a systematic review.
I would say I considered it, evidence synthesis, but I would say if you were going to try to make an argument for a type of, review with more stringent qualifications where you could maybe do some AI mucking around, that would be the only one I would really do. Like I wouldn't recommend it to anybody doing a true systematic review or meta-analysis type review. But really, I think um for students who are doing narrative reviews, there are not as many concerns, but anybody who's doing anything with any sort of, stringent guidelines, need to reproduce the results, et cetera. There's just a lot of evidence that discourages me from suggesting that they use, a true AI tool. Now I think there's room for evaluation and, some consideration discussion around like how do we evaluate our databases as more and more AI tools are used, and like does that dilute some of the benefits of the traditional methods that we've been touting for years when people are using a particular database for evidence synthesis type work, um, because again more and more of our databases are incorporating AI, and how does that change them? But again, that goes back to putting pressure on the vendors to be clear about what's happening. And then maybe sometimes making some tough choices about not turning on features if we have the option to keep things turned off until we're satisfied that what they're telling us they're capable of doing is really working in the ways that it should. We've had some conversations at my institution about EBSCO in particular, and having things maybe not be consistent. So I would really like to hear from others, what your experiences have been, specifically around databases. But that's a great question.
Another question, and you may have answered this. Does your institution subscribe to Scopus AI?
No, we don't. I'm
Okay.
kind of sad because I know a lot of people have access to Scopus or Site. We do not, and that's been one of the challenges for me is my faculty have been like, "Hey, we want you to teach our students about AI tools for literature reviews." And I'm like, but again, that's where now that some more of my databases are integrating AI, I'm turning this into a very different presentation than it was when I started. But I'm also setting more boundaries around what I think is best for the students. At first I was like, sure, and I figured out some things that I thought would be helpful, but the more I've learned, the more I've kind of been like, is this really, the best thing for my students? Is it really helping them, or is it creating more work for them?
Okay, and this was one for everybody that was on the
Hmm.
chat, but asked, does your institution rely on a specific framework or rubric for evaluating AI-based tools? I think there were some people who put some things in the chat. It says, we've been working on one, but this is difficult work with many stakeholders. So do you have any kind of thing there that you use?
We're still in the preliminary discussions. We've just formed two groups working on AI. And, again, like many others, we're kind of trying to get a handle on it and, determine our next steps.
Mhm.
So, I will say that's one of the reasons I was so excited to have, this opportunity and talk to others about what you're doing because, it is a tricky topic.
Okay, and then one is a comment. Some
Hmm.
faculty are choosing to have the students use an AI for more scholarly research, such as elicit, because they
Hmm.
are unlikely to have the databases at work. And we need to
Hmm.
begin to prepare them to use the resources they will have access to outside of the library environment.
Yeah,
Would
and I think that's a very valid point. Because again, I've had conversations with current students about like, do I have access to this when I leave? And as we know, they don't. And
you?
sometimes it might be out of reach financially for them to subscribe. Um, but yeah, that's a
Okay.
good point.
And the last one just came into the chat. Does anyone have access to Elsevier's Leap Space? If so, what are your thoughts on the research grade AI assisted workspace? I don't have it.
We do not, I will say this semester, and I did not put this in the presentation, but I was also asked to talk about AI agents. And I decided I didn't have enough information to really have that conversation yet. And since we don't, I mean, we have Microsoft Copilot will let you create an AI agent. But again, it's a little unclear to me at our institution when we talked about the database terms during the previous our presentation, like there's some conversation about like, can the students really upload content into Copilot, like according to our vendor agreements? So like that's something I'm going to have some conversations with folks about how we're wording our database terms. Because I think, again, there's that pressure from students. They want to be on the cutting edge. And I just am not always prepared to have the answer about, look, okay, I like to tell my students, there's always the question of, yes, you can, but should you?
Mm.
So that's something we talk about is technically you might be able to, but maybe don't.
Okay, I think we're like less than a minute away from time being up if anyone has another question.
Okay.
Christina, this has been an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. I'd love to continue the conversations if anyone wants to talk. And again, just thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. Have a great day, everyone.